Dr. Richard Beeching is a name not normally used when talking to railway enthusiasts. In fact, in some places, it's almost a taboo subject. But rather than talk about what he destroyed, let's talk about something that he actually advocated for. No, we're not talking motorways, although it was obvious he was a fan. We're going to Sheffield and to the newly formed Tinsley Marshalling Yard. It is a given that when you had a town or a city, a goods and marshalling yard wasn't far behind. For almost 150 years, freight by train was the norm, and since each railway company handled freight in its own particular way, when eventually the railways merged, kinda left a bit of a confusing mess. This was only compounded when freight began to leave the tracks in favour of motorways. In the north, in Sheffield, metalworking established itself as a freight powerhouse, and almost 10% of freight movements around the country were either started or destined for Sheffield. The multiple yards and infrastructure legacies left by the various railway companies were now becoming a hindrance to the city as it hampered it from expanding, something it desperately needed. In the early 1960s, the Sheffield District Council came together to tackle the problem, and using reports from the newly formed Rail Board, it created a plan to not only improve freight movements, but to also improve passenger services as well. The plan focused on several key areas, and yes, some places did need closures, but the main goal was to formally concentrate major freight movements into one massive yard. The yard would be based at Tinsley, east of the Meadowhall interchange. It used the old Sheffield District line as its main route. The line had been out of use just under 20 years, however a lot of the old line remained, and although the geography wasn't ideal, the land had remained untouched from developers, and it was an easy job to connect a multitude of routes to that yard. The land was levelled as much as possible, ready for the 48 sorting sidings, and it was made on a similar model to the large yards of the USA, called hump yards. These yards worked on tried and tested gravity. An artificial hump or a hill was created, and wagons were shunted up the hill, where a worker was on hand with a shunter's pole to uncouple each wagon at its crest. The wagon then would travel down the hill and then be sorted through switches by its destination. The majority of the sorting was done mostly by hand, but for Tinsley almost all of the switching was computerised. And to stop the wagons from crashing into one another, a device called a retarder was used. Retarders are devices that essentially, for lack of a better word, hug the wheels and act as a brake, slowing the truck down enough to come into close contact with the other truck's buffers, ready to be recoupled. Alongside the new yard, a new locomotive depot was also built, and local diesels moved in from the Grimethorpe depot. Steam locomotive depots closed shortly after, with the scrapping of many locomotives. By October, all was ready, and on the 24th it was opened by Dr. Richard Beeching himself. The yard would handle, on average, 3,000 wagons a day. To move such long trains over the hump, a unique class of engine would be needed. Standard engines would be prone to grounding, so a smaller engine was sought. The one fitting the bill was the numerous class 08. These little compact shunters were great for the yards, but they lacked the power to shunt the hundreds of cars that were needed. But a pair of them would be ideal. It was decided to couple them up in what is known as a master and slave configuration. The slave unit would receive all of its instructions from the master cab, and its own cab was removed. The engines were then fused nose to cab, with the master cab facing forward for better vision. To give it all better traction, both units were weighted down with ballast. In all, 3 of these classes, the Class 13s, were made especially for this yard. The yard, though, didn't work as well as everyone thought. Not that the yard didn't work on a technical sense, it did. In fact, a year after it opened, it was upgraded so that the electric haul trains could use the yard as well. It was the freight that was the problem, or rather, lack of it. The yard was never used to its full capacity, and thanks to roads and new motorways, there just wasn't enough freight to make the running of the trains profitable. It was easier and cheaper to have factories away from the tracks and closer to the roads and motorways. And lorries could take any amount of freight with no waiting around or organising of trains by British Rail. It also didn't help that by the 1970s, industrial decline was in full swing, and the move to gas from coal spelt disaster for the coal industry. In 1981, the electric workings was removed, citing lack of use, and by 1984, the yard was closed. The free Class 13s were all scrapped, as they were useless anywhere else. The majority of the yard was abandoned. The site was eventually repurposed with several international and private terminals opening, ready to support the rapidly expanding businesses and growing trades around the area. Today, Sheffield International Freight Terminal sits to the northwest of the site, while the Newell and Wright and GB Rail Freight sit where the old hump were. It took me a long while to find the site on Google Maps, and within the buildings and the woodlands, there is still some evidence of tracks of the former yard. The rest, though, long since been developed, and it's a site the UK will never see again. For the USA, though, hump yards are still in use, ready for its massive freight trains going to all four corners of the country.